It all started with the desire for a train. Our children are grown and there aren't a lot of presents under the tree anymore. At first, I'd meant the train to ride around under the tree. Then I thought I'd make gingerbread houses for the train to travel past. Then it occurred to me to build a tabletop diorama. I've made several small book nook-sized dioramas, and I liked the idea of working on a bigger scale. Based on the size of the train and the tracks, I cut the table to 3 feet by 5 feet. As the ideas accumulated, the design of the table changed to match, but always with the burden of where and how to store this thing. We move every couple of years, and I wanted the diorama to be able to break down and store and move easily. The legs and side panels are attached with bolts and wing nuts for easy setup and tear down. The mountain comes off separately. It and all of the elements will be packed into plastic tubs. My plan is to store the tabletop in a twin-size mattress box under one of the beds. We'll see. If the tabletop doesn't hold up, I can always go back to the original idea of putting the houses and train under the Christmas tree. The base is 2 sheets of insulation board glued to a 1/2-inch sheet of plywood. For the table stand, I wanted to use what I already had. Because the legs have other jobs, I didn't want to paint them, so I just put a black tube sock on each one. I have a lot of black sheets and curtains for photography drapery and blacking out windows, so I used 2 extra large twin-size flat sheets for the table skirt. I didn't cut or modify these because I want to be able to use them for other things. I ordered the houses on Amazon. They come in pre-cut cardboard kits. I used the houses but chose to make my own trees and gingerbread people. After assembling the houses, I spackled and then painted them to have the texture and color of a baked gingerbread cookie. Everything in the build that looks like piped frosting is actually silicone that you would use as a sealant in your bathroom or kitchen. The colored frosting is clear silicone mixed with acrylic paint. When the silicone is still wet, the color is cloudy, but once it's cured, the colors are quite vibrant. When you've added paint to the silicone, the full cure will take 2 to 3 days. I used Wilton cake decorating bags and tips and piped the silicone like decorating a cake. The candies were made with polymer clay. The peppermints and gumdrops have a wooden center because a wooden center is cheaper than making them with solid clay. Some of the candies were painted with acrylic paint for a more vibrant color. All were sealed with gloss Mod Podge. The gumdrops were sprinkled with coarse glitter to look like sugar crystals. Some of the houses were decorated to be pretty, and others were intended to be a bit gaudy looking because that's the nature of gingerbread house decorating. The mountain is layers of foam stacked and glued together. There were gaps in the mountain layers that I tried to fill with spray foam. I did not anticipate that as the spray foam expanded, that it would push the layers of the mountain apart and warp it. I leveled the underside of the mountain with layers of foam sheets so that it would sit flush to the table and not rock. In retrospect, I wish I had also cut the top so that the house and trees would sit level instead of at an angle. The angle made taking pictures weird, and if you bump the table, those trees tip over too easily. Another thing I'd do differently if I had a chance was mapping my village in black Sharpie. The tabletop and the mountain were painted with a layer of Mod Podge and white paint to seal the foam. After 3 more coats of white, full-bodied acrylic paint, the Sharpie was still very visible. While the snow did cover it, I think next time I'll try using a gray alcohol marker. The edges of the tabletop and mountain were textured with spackle and then painted with various browns to look like stacked layers of chocolate cake. To light the houses, I drilled holes through the tabletop and mountain and then lined the holes with PVC pipe to make threading the LED strips easier. I could have embedded the wires in the foam on top and then covered the trenches with spackle and snow, but instead I chose to run the wiring under the table. I wanted to maintain access to the wiring in case one of the strips went out. At first, the light from the strips was too piercing. I bought some plastic DIY Christmas bulbs, painted them yellow, and put the LED strips inside. This helped to dampen and diffuse the light and still keep the light bright enough that you can tell that the houses are lit even during the day. I had initially thought that I wouldn't fix the track to the tabletop, but to keep the train moving through the mountain tunnel smoothly, the track really needed to be fixed to one position, which then inspired the idea for gravel under and around the track. I bought and sorted 5 pounds of pre-colored fish tank gravel. I repainted them to match what I thought was how nerds would look, but when I had laid the gravel, because of the size, it looks more like Fruity Pebbles than nerds. I'm okay with it. I think the color is a great addition to what otherwise would be a large, mostly white field. The base of the pond was sealed with a mixture of light blue paint and Mod Podge. The pond is poured resin lightly dyed blue. My daughter had the idea of putting mini Swedish fish in the pond, so I made a mold from the candy and then used UV resin to make the fish. I didn't get a good cure on the resin, and I think that was because the mold is opaque. I did try pouring and curing in layers, but the resin against the mold, especially in the corners, never really cured. In spite of this, I still like the fish I got. With the pond, I poured an initial layer of resin and let it cure for 2 days. Then I glued all but one of the fish to the first layer of the pond with Mod Podge, and then poured the second layer of resin. The last fish I had to hold down on one end to keep his tail submerged. He looks like he's coming up for a bit of air, and I like that. I had intended to fill the pond completely, but resin is expensive. I dug the pond to be just at 1 inch deep and roughly 15 inches long and 8 inches at the widest part. In the first 2 pours, I had already used between 30 and 40 ounces of resin, and I wasn't willing to spend any more money to fill it the rest of the way. So I piped some snow drifts around the shoreline and called it good. At this point, my husband and daughter both felt like there needed to be 2 more things: village occupants and a way to get up to the top of the mountain. Some ideas were knocked around for the mountain: a ski lift, a zip line. In the end, I just cut steps into the mountain and made mini Nutter Butter bars to pave the steps. The wafer is made from granny squares filled with spackle. I used silicone mixed with brown paint as the cream between the layers and coated each bar with a final thin layer of brown silicone. I was pretty proud of this idea, and I wanted the wafer layers to show. For occupants, we have a snowman and some gingerbread people. The gingerbread people are cardboard, spackled and painted to look like gingerbread in the same way as the houses. Their clothes and eyes were done with fabric puffy paint. With the snowman, I was thinking cake pop balls, so he's comprised of tinfoil balls covered with the same goop I used to simulate snow on the table. His eyes, mouth, and buttons are leftover fish tank gravel. Once I had placed all the elements on the table and marked walking paths, I lined the paths with piped white silicone and also piped around the houses and trees. For the snow, I made a soupy mixture of baking soda, Mod Podge, and white paint. The ratio doesn't really matter, and sometimes I added a little bit of water for extra soupiness. I covered the tabletop with snow in small sections at a time so that I could sprinkle very fine glitter on while it was still wet. The full cure for the snow takes at least a day, but if you wait more than about 5 minutes, the top crusts over fast enough that the glitter won't stick. And that's it. Now you know.